Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very, very warm welcome to you for this Caabu panel on the war in the Middle East, deliberately entitled as such because it obviously has wide Middle East ramifications. It's not just about Israel and Iran. We've had US attacks. We are, as we go live, hearing about Iranian missile attacks, we understand, on Qatar and the American base there. And of course, it all happens with the genocide in Gaza still continuing, military action still in the West Bank, a Middle East that is facing a major crisis, perhaps the likes of which we haven't seen since at least 2003. So we brought together a really star-studded panel for you tonight. I think four people that I know that I listen to very carefully in terms of what they write, what they say and broadcast, and hopefully they can guide us through what is clearly a very worrying, alarming, confusing situation and shine some light on it for us. We are being recorded, so if you miss anything or have to leave, you'll be able to catch up with it later on. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our four speakers, Hellyer, Azadeh Moaveni, Jasmine El-Gamal, and Daniel Levy. Daniel, I think, will be joining us in a moment. But we are going to kick off with Hellyer, who is a great friend of mine, somebody I've known for many years. He's an internationally recognized expert on security, and he is a senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute here in London, a major think tank, as you know. And we've had him before on Caabu events. And Hisham, we'd love to hear from you more as to how the region, the Middle East, sees this. How is it going to pan out? What is increasingly spreading across and causing a lot of alarm and concern? Where are we going with all of this? Would it spread to other countries? How do you see it all?
Well, Chris, thank you very much. I'm very pleased that you admit to the world that we are friends. Actually, I've known Chris for more than 20 years, but he hasn't aged while I have a lot of white in my beard. And the world looks far more complicated today than when we first met so many years ago. It's a very poignant moment, I think, to be having this conversation. I'm talking to you from Cairo today, where I'm visiting, and I've spent a lot of time in the region over the past few months, but also over the past couple of years. I was in Turkey last week as well, and I think it's a testament to Caabu that it tries to assemble a meeting like this where we try to see how the region where all of these things are taking place actually sees the situation, as opposed to constructing what frankly comes across as very cartoonish, very removed from reality kind of pictures that you might see in DC or London. Within the region, I have to say, there's a picture of, I think, rage, of disillusionment, and a growing belief that the rules of the international system simply don't apply equally. And there are a few conflicts that have happened recently that I think give that impression to many in the region. And here I'm talking about on the top level in terms of leaders and governments, but also on a popular level. And on both of those levels, I think the region has witnessed the war on Gaza over the past 20 months as not just shaking the Palestinian territories in the occupied territories of East Jerusalem, of the West Bank and Gaza, but really it's gone throughout the Arab world, it's gone throughout the wider Middle East. And I don't need to, I'm sure, repeat the consequences of that war on Gaza to anybody here, but tens of thousands of people killed, most of whom are civilians, the decimation of the Gaza Strip, and that that war on Gaza is not seen in the region as a war on Hamas. It's seen as collective punishment of the Palestinians of Gaza. It's seen as ethnic cleansing. It's seen as a profound violation of international law and of genocide. So it's against that backdrop that we see people's reactions to what has happened over the last few days and last 10 days. But of course, it's not simply about Gaza as well. It's also about what happened in Lebanon, where the war between Israel and Hezbollah also spilled over into Lebanon more widely and resulted at the end of it in a further invasion of Lebanon and occupation of several positions in Lebanon. And I think that people forget about that because the Lebanese front, as it were, is much more quiet than it used to be. But you still see airstrikes from the Israelis, the killing of civilians, the destroying of different parts of infrastructure. And yes, of course, the main targets here are Hezbollah, but it's not simply Hezbollah that feels that pain. And then, of course, finally, when it comes to Syria, where following the falling of the Assad regime in Syria and the establishment of a new set of authorities in Damascus, the Israelis continued to bomb, continued to conduct airstrikes, have invaded more Syrian territory. Of course, it's occupied Syrian territory since 1967, but it's occupied yet more Syrian territory. And all of this, I think, is important for people to note because it's how the region is now interpreting what is happening vis-a-vis Iran. Okay, that there's this sense that there is an environment of impunity that is being allowed to fester, that is underwritten by many in Western capitals in that regard. There's very little, if any, accountability, despite the fact that it seems to be a matter of consensus that international law has been violated on so many levels, and yet response to that is extremely difficult to come by. And I think the region also sees how different European leaders have responded, how the United States has responded, how the UK has responded. And the constant sort of reminder I get in the region is that it feels to them like there's one law for Israel and another law for everyone else. And then came this escalation between Israel and Iran, which I'll try to summarize as best as possible in terms of the perceptions. There's very little sympathy for Iran in terms of the regime of Iran within the region. I think that that's been very clear, especially once you see the Syrian regime become toppled. There is no state ally in that regard at all. Hezbollah, which was the strongest of the Iranian allied militias forces, is much weaker than it used to be. What is left of the quote unquote axis of resistance are the Houthis and Iraqi militias and a very weakened Hezbollah. Beyond that, you see incredible cynicism from around the region vis-a-vis Iran, recognizing the damage that the Iranian regime has wrought across the region. And this is important. Even with all of that taken into account, the overwhelming, and I say overwhelming pretty much down to a man and woman, the feeling is that Iran is not the actual main problem here, that the Iranian regime was at the table for negotiations. The Gulf countries that had previously been expressing tremendous concern around the Iranian regime and wanting Donald Trump to withdraw from the JCPOA and Trump won are the same countries that for the past few months have been urging for negotiations between Tehran and DC. They did not want a military confrontation. They do not want escalation. On the contrary, they are working very, very hard, publicly and privately, to de-escalate. And I think that's very important. that you note that despite the incredible cynicism around the Iranian regime and the true antipathy that exists for very justifiable reasons, that regional leaders and regional actors are not enthusiastic at all about any sort of escalation. That they see this as an incredibly poor precedent, that it calls into question even further the rules-based international order, that the dropping of, I think, the largest bomb that exists beyond a nuclear device on Iranian territory without a mandate from the United Nations Security Council um, is incredibly telling about that moment in regional affairs that we're in. So the response I think you've seen over the past 10 days, again, from countries that are already incredibly cynical about the Iranians, is one of complete opposition to Israel's activities, to the American strike. And I think that it's going to stay that way. I do think that I don't want to talk too much about the Iranian response because I'm sure that others will get into that more. But I think that even against the backdrop of Iranian reprisals. And as Chris noted, there were already some reprisals that took place against Udeid Air Base in Qatar only about sort of half an hour or so ago. I don't think that's going to change the calculus. I don't think that's going to change how the Gulf states actually view the situation. I think they're very concerned about this current moment, but I think they're also worried about the precedent going forward in terms of a regional security architecture that is governed by rules, that is governed by international law. None of that seems likely at the present moment in time. If you had asked me 2 years ago who the Gulf states thought was the biggest threat to regional stability, I would have told you without a doubt they would have said the Iranians. Today, that answer has changed. They see the Israelis as being the greatest destabilizing factor in the region. And I'll stop there and provide time for everybody else. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Hisham. I think that was a very excellent introduction to it, and I couldn't agree more about the way in which the region sees this. I think you've summed it up very well. We have Daniel Levy with us, and I know, Daniel, you have time issues. Are you with us there and ready to go?
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can indeed. Fantastic. So we are very lucky to have Daniel Levy with us, who is the president, no less, of the US Middle East Project. I think many of you would have heard from him before. He's a former Israeli negotiator working under Yossi Beilin, but really a brilliant analyst, particularly of Israeli matters, but also the broader Middle East. Daniel, one image has stuck in my mind over the last couple of days since the US attack, and that was Bibi Netanyahu looking punch drunk almost at the news that he's successfully managed to get the United States involved to drop those bunker busting bombs. How do you see the Israeli objectives going forward now? Is it regime change? What is their exit strategy? It is something I think is probably one of the biggest questions out there as to when Israel draws a line under all of this.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I apologize. When you set this up, I said I'd be able to come on briefly. I'm glad I got to hear you, Hisham, and I apologize that I will have to step off. So that's not me being rude. I said at the outset, I'm just propping up a tree. No, sorry, these are the circumstances I'm speaking to you from. So let me try and focus in responding to your point. It won't come as news to anyone that Netanyahu has spoken about this moment for more than 3 decades. And we've often been treated to, the Iranians are on the precipice, this is about to happen. He's finally pulled an American president into direct action. different kind of direct action to what's been in the news. And this is a major success for him. When I think about this, I honestly, for all the exceptionality and the particularism and peculiarity of the Israel-US relationship, I do think that if you'd have said to Netanyahu on October the 8th, within about 19, 20 months from now, you will have had a Democrat administration that continued to arm you, provide full diplomatic, political cover and armaments during month after month of war crimes in Gaza, even after the ICC, the ICJ, genocide. And then you'd get the next administration to actually come in and bomb Iran after you initiated. He'd have said, yeah, I'm an optimistic dude, but even I rest my gentle heart. So we are where we are. I think Netanyahu effectively undermined the negotiations and took it to a place where Trump became convinced, and I don't want to do too much Trump psychobabble, but Trump became convinced that the Israelis had done the heavy lifting. He could finish this off. It's a familiar place of downplaying bad case scenarios, and kind of this is a slam dunk. Netanyahu, I would argue, went down this route not because of the things he's claimed vis-a-vis the imminent threat from Iran, the hurtling towards weaponization. Those things aren't true. Israel is a nuclear armed state. He is getting close to at least the starting line of an Israeli election campaign in which he has consistently been behind in the polls. He is still facing charges in Israeli courts. He is aware that he's in last chance political saloon, and he had to roll some dice, and these were risky dice to roll, but he chose to do that. And this is really crucial because I want to link it back into what Hisham said about the Palestine situation. Yes, it was helpful to have a distraction in the immediacy of the moment when the levels of Israeli cruelty against the civilian population in Gaza, and let's not forget what they're doing in the West Bank either, but the level of cruelty had gone to a new level, and the transparency of that cruelty had gone to a new level, especially in these distribution sites. But that immediate distraction, I think, is just a happy coincidence, perhaps, for Netanyahu. More significant is that if you want to go on this journey of so-called total victory, not against Hamas, it's against the Palestinian people who are being ethnically cleansed and genocided. If you want to go on that journey, you need to establish hegemony. You can't do that without America. The balance of power is not sufficiently in your favor without the US. And you need to then set out a clear message to the rest of the region: come under the warm blanket of US-Israeli hegemony, and the rest of the region can't find a place there because Israel has no political horizon. Every problem it sees, the answer is a bomb. And the crimes against the Palestinians are an inextricable part of the Israeli plan for the region. Now, we've got here, and he's brought the American president into this. I think Netanyahu actually faces a bit of a dilemma. I genuinely think this is the case, which is stick or twist, right? So he is, by bringing in the Americans, he has got a significant win. There's not polling out yet since the American strike. After the Israelis had the strike, the bounce for Netanyahu was underwhelming. He will hope that that's not the case after this, the political bounce, I mean the polling bounce. And he now has to decide, do I rest on my laurels or do I push further, which is risky. It's risky, I would argue, in the following way. There's already a lot of disquiet inside the MAGA camp. If this goes further, that could reach new levels, and it might even turn the president. However, because he's already got the Americans in, the temptation to go up the escalatory ladder and to go up the ladder in terms of potential goals of this operation, specifically vis-a-vis the regime in Iran, that temptation is great. And it's, of course, encouraged when Trump sets out the kind of tweet he did specifically on that subject. And you can't make sense of some of Israel's actions without thinking that the regime is in the crosshairs, and they've said that. I don't think the Israelis, by the way, believe in some kind of neat regime change. I think what we're looking at here is to create chaos, collapsing state, failed state. This is a state of 90 million. That is very, very destabilizing for the surrounding region. So I think, and I think we're right in that moment now. My wildly optimistic take on the last half hour, and I imagine I'll be proven that it is wildly optimistic and unfortunately not the case, would be that there was a suspiciously large amount of pre-warning time, apparently, to evacuate Udeid, to close Qatari airspace. Udeid is not in the heart of an urban center. It doesn't do tremendous damage. There's some degree of back-channel coordination. The Iranians do this. The Americans don't respond heavily. Everyone has their victory narrative, and we can draw some kind of a line under this. I don't think we can draw a full line after what's been done, but the more likely is that the scenario is that this carries on, intensifies, and then Trump has a problem. And for the Israelis, the success is pulling the Americans in, because once the Americans are in, it's their problem, not Israel's problem. And Israel does not care what kind of havoc it wreaks in the region, what kind of problems America has to face. And therefore, there is that fight in the America first versus Israel first community. I don't think it's realistic to talk now about a return to negotiations in which Iran capitulates. I should shut up there. You're on mute, Chris.
That was excellent. Thank you very much, Daniel. Whilst we have you, and I know you might be, just very quick question. You talked about stick and twist there. What if Netanyahu actually sees the light and thinks, actually, I'm going to take the victory? How does that actually play out? How does he get out of this without having to escalate further if he feels that's a better option?
In significant measure, it depends what's happening in these very moments, whether that leads to further direct and escalated American involvement, depending on what the outcome of this strike is. Because I do think that Netanyahu, there's a lot of talk in Israel about not being sucked into a war of attrition. Netanyahu hinted at this in his own press conference yesterday. There are question marks as to how many interceptor missiles the Israelis have left. So I think the way that looks, and I think there'd have to be some kind of back-to-back coordination of this, and there are countries who would be candidates to playing this role, is the Iranians declare what they declare in terms of they stood tall, they failed to collapse the regime, they responded to the Americans, they've made those direct hits continuously against Tel Aviv, blah, blah. The Israelis have their victory narrative, easy to write. The Americans, not mine, the Americans have their victory narrative. Those, of course, can't equate if you stand them next to each other, but given that in those respective capitals, in the adversarial sides, no one believes what the other says anyway, it's not so difficult a thing to pull off. Like, I don't want to get carried away with this scenario because I do think it's not a likely, but it's the best scenario we have at the moment. I would say that in those circumstances, Israel is still the perpetual war leader because that carries on in Gaza. He will still do things in Syria. They're still occupying parts of Lebanon. You could still see Israeli potential strikes on Yemen. Apparently, America is now sharing intelligence it wasn't sharing before after the Israelis were peeved at the separate deal the Americans cut with the Houthis. So I think that's what it looks like.
Daniel, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it, and especially because you obviously have a lot on at the moment, and it's really worth every second you've given us. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Azadeh Moaveni, a journalist, writer, and associate professor at New York University, where she directs the global journalism program. And she's been a correspondent for many newspapers and reported from across the region. Azadeh, how does this look for Iran and Iranians right now? Obviously alarming, but what are the options for the regime? Many people wonder if regime change or collapse is likely. How do you see it?
I think I'm off mute. Thank you very much. It's really good to be in company of colleagues and with all of you. Thank you. I mean, what can Iran do next? I mean, I think we've covered a little bit of that so far. There could be an end after this round, of course, but it's a very complicated and sort of multi-dimensional chessboard for Iran. It depends on whether Trump absorbs this sort of performative escalation that we've seen in the last hour. This is a sort of repeat of previous rounds of conflict where Iran gives advance warning, bases are emptied, it can claim victory. I think this kind of ambiguity around that both sides are expressing about to what extent the nuclear sites in Iran have been damaged, to what extent definitively. There are scenarios in which escalation could sort of stop after Iran responds. It can claim that it saved face, but also if we're still back in the same sort of cul-de-sac of Iran having to capitulate and agree to the Trump red line of zero enrichment, with the Israelis sort of looming over with fighter jets above the skies, sort of threatening to bomb the country or bombing it unless Iranians sign, then we're still in a war phase. And what will that look like next? I don't think the Iranians have any confidence that even if they were to sign some sort of agreement, going back to the consortium model of enrichment that had been tabled, that Trump will rein in Netanyahu. What guarantee do they have that he will not continue to strike Iran, strike other nuclear sites? What guarantee do they have that he will not continue to hit all these different sites that are the sort of military security apparatus of the state, seeking to stabilize its ability to govern? There are scenarios in which Iran moves towards withdrawing from the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Does it secretly move to weaponize and then sort of signal that at some point down the line? So I think, we're all listening to the news. We know that that it's a sort of multi-vectored situation that could go in many different ways and may not be resolved in the horizon of 2 weeks, 1 month. On the question of regime collapse, and what that could look like and whether that's well received in Iran. I mean, I would say that the Israelis and Trump both sort of kind of created a blockage for themselves, if that's sort of the intention or the dream, making explicit the idea or the intention that these strikes, that this war on Iran is about regime change, has inflamed and will inflame and create a sort of backlash of public sentiment that may not have kindled in that way had that not been made so sort of readily explicit. Iranians, of course, are a very alienated society. There are deep fissures between state and society, and they have an internal process of seeking to change that's been going on from the bottom up through the Women Life Freedom Movement, from the top down through changes that we've seen in the political structure in the last year after the death of President Raisi, the election of President Pezeshkian. There's an ongoing kind of maneuvering around succession of the supreme leader. So all of that is sort of fermenting in Iran already at the sort of public level and at the regime state establishment level. Iranians have become fiercely, I would say, anti-Israeli in the last week, in that the declaration that these strikes are intended to topple their government and to chart their destiny for them is of course something that Iranians who have a long historical memory of moments in the last 100 years when different foreign powers and Western powers have tried to and have unseat their leaders, install new leaders, resist that. Iran as a society has a long and sophisticated history of political engagement. It's been rumbling and reshaping itself in different models for decades now. But leaders who come in, whether it's the Shah in 1953, put back on the throne by the US and the UK, whether it's leaders who sided with Saddam during the Iran-Iraq War, those kind of leaders who try to come into power or exploit moments where Iran is being attacked in order to insert themselves into the very top of politics are seen as illegitimate and reviled. So I think that the sense, I mean, certainly, ongoing strikes across the board, political decapitation further of Iran's leadership may indeed create havoc in Iran, and there are scenarios in which that worsens. I think we haven't seen the Israelis turn to the actual kind of regime destabilization game plan that may be lying ahead. But the way that this has been presented, I think, has clearly and palpably shifted public sentiment inside. You can see that, and this will be the last thing that I mention. You can see that in the way that civil society figures, prominent human rights figures inside the country are shifting their statements, the way that prominent journalists who are really sort of valued and respected in society, who cover political dissidents, who cover civil disobedience, are now covering the humanitarian toll of this conflict. And the external opposition that is fragmented, that is not really able to capture this moment, is now playing catch up and also changing their tune, trying to sound more nationalistic, trying to sound anti-Netanyahu. So you have a sort of collective sense and indignation that the Iranian public would be. There would be an attempt to seize and capture at this moment so that outside forces could direct the future of the country. Maybe it's interesting to very quickly mention succession, the succession scenarios of the supreme leader, which have been, the sort of political hottest issue of Iran's transition in recent years. I think it's interesting to see that that's going to be accelerated. It might be accelerated if the supreme leader is killed, whether that's through an Israeli airstrike, whether that's through a domestic assassination attempt that's blamed on the Israelis. I think that's the sort of next thing to watch, because clearly there's going to be a reconfiguration in Iran domestically. There will be some kind of new dispensation, and who comes into play in that? I think you'll see a lot of features in the Murdoch press about Reza Pahlavi, less attention about the domestic figures inside, people like Hassan Khomeini, who are being talked about as a successor to the supreme leader, who are interesting, who are not tainted by the sort of corruption and the brutality that surrounds the current regime. I think, looking inside for figures that have some legitimacy, some respect, who might be at the center of some kind of transition. I'll stop there.
Azadeh, thank you very much indeed for that. That was absolutely excellent. I think compliments what our other speakers have said. And now you may have heard Daniel referring to Trump psychobabble earlier on. We now have the person who's going to decipher all that for us. Jasmine El-Gamal is a writer and analyst focusing on US policy and the Middle East. She's the deputy director of the Oxford Process, and she used to be a Middle East policy advisor at the Pentagon during the Obama administration. Jasmine, thank you very much for being with us today. And I'm not sure I can really land you with the job of interpreting Trump's psychological state. But give us a sense, really, in your view, as to how the American political scene is going to impact this. We've heard a lot of debate about the MAGA crowd who aren't happy with this intervention versus the neocons, the Israel first versus America first. To what extent is Trump listening to them? How do you think this is going to play out for the United States? You're on mute.
Sorry. 5 years after COVID, and I still can't figure this out. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be with such great colleagues, and thank you, Chris and the Caabu team, as always, for such a fascinating and timely discussion. Now, you're right. It is not always fun to be the person who is asked to to decipher Donald Trump and the American perspective right now. It's not easy because there isn't necessarily a lot of rhyme or reason, but there are a few things that we can look at and put together to try to, if not predict 100% every step of the way, at least try to figure out the general direction of where things are going. So let's just talk about, so a lot of stuff has been said. I mean, my colleagues have covered very, very well the context in which all of this is happening. Let me just say, from a US perspective and from a defense planning perspective, that this is one of the scenarios that almost 100% would have been on the table. And probably, if it remains and if it stops here on the Iranian side, the most preferred one. For people who don't know me, I worked at the Pentagon. I was an advisor at the Pentagon for 8 years. So I'm quite familiar with the planning process, the kind of scenario, gaming out what might happen, how to respond, and what to be prepared for. And so as soon as even before the US decided to strike Iran, the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, Intelligence, the CIA director, all of these departments and buildings would have been talking the president through what the potential ramifications would be of a US strike on Iran. And I think the options have been laid out. They could have done nothing, but that would have been really hard for Iran to swallow, to not do anything at all. It would have completely destroyed any kind of deterrence that it has left, and that deterrence has already been severely weakened after the loss of Hezbollah and Hamas as credible proxies, to a lesser extent the Houthis. So it was always unlikely that they weren't going to respond at all. Another option was that they could have responded against Israel and Israel only as a response to US strikes, or they could have responded directly against the US. Now, attacking US personnel or assets in the region, it definitely comes with a lot of risk for Iran. If it had targeted US personnel in the region, if any US service member or even civilian had been hit, we would be talking about something completely different right now. But as far as we can see, what they did, and again, I say if it stops here on the Iranian side, is probably the least risky. And I know some people are disagreeing with this, and we can talk about it, but I think it's the least risky option Iran could have chosen, because I say this because the US base in Qatar is not a base that is nested within civilian areas. It's not even close. It's a purely military base. There are no civilians allowed, and it's quite far away from anything that could be described as civilian. The second thing is that, according to all the reports I'm reading now, and this was, of course, something that would have been expected as a best case scenario, Iran had telegraphed these attacks to the Qataris with the knowledge of the US, saying this is what we're going to do. And you can see that in the way Qatar was prepared. They closed down their airspace, they evacuated the base, they intercepted all the missiles. This was not a surprise attack by any means. And again, according to reports I'm reading here, the Iranian Supreme National Security Council announced specifically that the number of missiles that were used to attack Al-Udeid were the same number of missiles that the same number of bombs that were dropped by the US on Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, this is important because what the Iranians are doing here is they're highlighting parity and proportional responses as a means to try to de-escalate. Now, de-escalation is possible at the moment if the Israelis also decide to wind down their operations ASAP, because President Trump has made it clear in his marketing of this move that this was a targeted strike, that he's not going to war, and that he wants Iran to get back to the negotiating table. And Iran has now responded in a way that allows it both to save face, because they're saying one thing domestically and one thing internationally, and still be able to say this was proportional. We did what any sane country would do when it was attacked. So the Israel factor is a wild card. I think Daniel mentioned that. And although the Israelis have said that they would wind down in the next few days, I don't take that at face value, because we've seen since October 7th and the response and the ensuing Israeli response, not just in Gaza, but around the region, that you can't always take Netanyahu at his word. Now, where does this leave Donald Trump? So this is the interesting part. Donald Trump obviously campaigned on a very, very strong platform of no more wars, no Middle East wars, no US blood spilled for anyone else, America first. He, in contrast to the Biden administration, he talked tougher when it came to Israel. He wasn't a lifelong self-professed Zionist. He doesn't really have any ideological ties to Israel or anything else, really. He's, Donald Trump first, America first. So he managed to be a bit tougher, at least when it came to rhetoric towards the Israelis, and he appeared to deliver very, very quickly out of the gate by forcing a ceasefire between between Israel and Hamas in January. Now, since then, he has sort of, I think, proven that the words were a lot tougher than the actions have been. He has largely followed Netanyahu's lead when it comes to the region for different reasons. I think when it comes to Gaza, he just lost interest. He's actually not that interested in Gaza, and he just doesn't see it as worth his time. So he started out strong. He did the ceasefire. He sent Steve Witkoff over with some tough messages, and then very quickly remembered how difficult it is to deal with Benjamin Netanyahu, to deal with these issues, Hamas and everything else. And he just decided to kind of back off. On Iran, though, I don't think it's the same. He is interested, but he's interested because what happens in Iran and with Iran says a lot about the US, about the power of the US, about the ability of the US to bring Iran to the table, about getting a different deal with Iran, a better deal than Obama was able to get with the JCPOA, which Trump left in his first term. So Iran is not just about Iran, it's about Donald Trump, which means he surely will not be losing interest in it anytime soon. So what we've seen is that I think Netanyahu got to Trump at the end of the day. And I think it's easy to imagine how they were speaking more than once a day. And it's very easy to imagine those conversations and put yourself, we know what Netanyahu's talking points are, a mixture of fear and alarmism, but also importance and savior, sort of, appealing to Trump's savior complex. So on one hand, Israel is in danger. This is imminent. Trust us. We have the intelligence. And it's true that the Israelis have pierced Iran in a way, intelligence-wise, that is huge. It's actually, they know everything that is going on. Now, knowing everything and knowing the data points, which is what intelligence is, it's data points, and interpreting those data points in a good faith way are two different things. Just because they have the data points doesn't mean that they're interpreting the intelligence in a good faith way. And until this day, both the IAEA and the US intelligence assessments differ from that of the Israelis. But it was probably a mixture of Israel is in imminent danger, we are doing this not just for us, but for you. We're saving the free world. We're saving the civilized world, which is what they've been saying about Gaza. And also you, Mr. President, are the only person in the world that can save humanity. Those were probably Bibi's talking points. We know them, and that plays very well to Trump's ego. So Trump was likely to say, okay, fine, I'll do it. I'll get this done. I'll finish it, and I'll bring us back to the negotiating table. So I say this because I still believe largely, I'm pretty confident that Trump does not want, he still wants to be a deal maker in the Middle East. He's just having a hard time withstanding the pressure from Netanyahu and the pressure from within the hawks in his own party, the Republican Party. And maybe the last thing I'll say, two quick things. One is on the domestic state of play. So you have the hawks, Lindsey Graham's and Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, who was kicked out of the National Security Council for reportedly planning all of this with Iran, with Israel, planning how to do it. Those are the hawks. Those are the people who have been pushing Trump to attack. And then you have MAGA, you have Marjorie Taylor Greene and Tucker Carlson and his entire cabinet, really, other than Mike Waltz. They're all America First isolationists. The issue with that second crowd, the MAGA crowd, is that no matter how much pressure they try to put on Trump, they will only go so far, because at the end of the day, MAGA is Trump. He is their everything. So there's no real risk that he's going to lose the MAGA base in a very significant way. They might be upset with him. They might go out and say, what are you doing? You promised that you wouldn't do this. But at the end of the day, MAGA is beholden to Trump. They are loyal to him in a way that we haven't really seen in American politics before, because most of the people in government right now and in the positions that they're in government would never be there if it wasn't for Donald Trump. They owe him everything. So he's not worried about losing MAGA or being forced out or anything like that. The last thing I'll say, and I'll say this quickly so we can leave time for a discussion, is I think the thing that I worry about the most, two things. One is, what if it doesn't stop here? So what if Israel decides to continue? That's something that I worry about, because then we are getting closer to the possibility of miscalculation and escalation, uncontrolled escalation, and an all-out war. The second thing I worry about, especially as an American, as a former American official, and also as just someone who is very committed to international law and diplomacy, is what does this say about America's word now, going forward? We've seen the US time and again now, and most recently with this, say something and do something else. They promise that they want to negotiate, and then they strike. They promise that they're negotiating in good faith, and then they don't deliver. We saw it in Gaza when Eden Alexander was released, that there was a promise that Hamas, that there would be an end to the war, that humanitarian aid would come in. Witkoff was not able to deliver on that. And now with Iran, when the US started out its position allowing for enrichment, then going to zero enrichment, which is the Israeli position, and then striking after they gave Iran 2 weeks to come back to the table. So what impact is that going to have now, both in the region and globally, when you don't have any trust in what the US says, and the Europeans, frankly, have proven themselves to be completely irrelevant in this? So I'll stop with that and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. I think that was an excellent segue for the conversation and the Q&A. We're not going to have time to read out every question, so I'm going to give our panelists a chance to answer some of them. And I'm going to start with Hisham, because there's a question about the UK position and how weak we are. And Jasmine's just damned the European position. How do you see the UK position?
So I did not train as a diplomat, Chris, but I will try to be as diplomatic as possible. And I'll say two things here. One, I think that there are a lot of people inside Majesty's government that are horrified at what's going on right now in Gaza, and also within the Gulf. But I think that there's an overriding calculus within the government at the leadership level that alignment with Washington, D.C., and at least the absence of being in opposition to Washington, D.C. is something that the UK cannot afford. So this puts them in the position, the rather strange position of, on one day talking about how they don't want to see any escalation and that they think escalation is a terrible idea. And then the strikes happen, which are, of course, a massive escalation. And instead of saying, we think that was a bad idea and now we hope that they de-escalate, they simply avoid the first part of that. And they completely, wrap themselves up in, verbal gymnastics in order not to say that dropping this massive ordinance on Iran was a bad idea. So I don't think that the UK sees. I don't agree with this, by the way, but I don't think that the government identifies that it's an option for them to be openly opposed to American policy pretty much anywhere. And you've seen this when it comes to Ukraine. You've seen it when it comes to the Middle East. I don't think it's a position that's born out of a conviction that actually what the US is doing on this level or on this level, on this issue, on this issue is correct. I think it's a calculation that they think, well, we can't do this alone. We have to have the Americans on side, so we have to avoid being in opposition against them. Again, it's not necessarily a position I hold myself, but that is where I think they're coming from.
Thank you very much for that. Now, we've had a couple more questions. One, perhaps I can put to you, Azadeh, because it's asking about ordinary civilians. And obviously, we don't have Daniel with us to talk about Israelis, but Iranian civilians. I mean, when Donald Trump warns them all to evacuate Tehran, a city of 10 million, when you have an internet blackout, when you have strikes going off every single day, I mean, what are you able to sort of pick up in terms of a sense of where ordinary Iranians are at the moment in all of this?
Thank you. I'm just going to very quickly say that I slightly disagree with Hisham on the UK question. I think the UK sees Iran as an enemy ever since it got involved in the Ukraine war on the side of Russia. And I think that the rhetoric coming out of British officials about Iran is very strong. I think they're completely on board. I think Lamy was probably complicit in the kind of duping of Iran around 2 weeks. So I'll end there, but I think that the UK is done with Iran and is happy to see this regime collapse, even if it ends up in a failed state, which is what Israel wants. On ordinary people and civilians, I mean, it's, we don't have a lot of foreign reporters in Iran. The Iranian system, of course, is disastrous with comms and propaganda. The internet has been shut down for much of the last week. So it's really hard to have a picture. But I think, Tehran was emptied out. It was a mass displacement of a civilian population. It reminded me, I reported on the displacement of Ukrainians in the early days of the Russian full-scale invasion. It reminded me very much of that. You have like a huge civilian population on the move, very vulnerable people, of course, who are too poor, who are refugees, who are Afghan refugees, who are disabled, are not able to, and if they are living in areas that are just being bombed continuously. I mean, there were neighborhoods of central Tehran that were just the site of endless bombing night after night. And we know that a lot of those sites were military sites, but the sense that ordinary people had that they had to escape, could they escape, that they were potentially getting caught in the crossfires of this. I think that there's a fear that that will escalate and that this will become like the Gaza war, that Iranians will be themselves the mechanism through which the Israelis try to make the regime collapse and suffer. There's a lot of solidarity, as I mentioned earlier. I think that that's sort of coalescing people around a sense that, you know, they're going to survive this together, and they're not going to let it be a moment where, like, this will not be their tipping point. They will not be tipped by this moment and by these external actors. But an extremely vulnerable population. I mean, I'll end it in a second, but I just want to say Iran has had 50% inflation year after year for the last 5 years. It cannot import medications. It has had limited access to all sorts of health and medical products and sort of basic goods. So this is a population that's already very fragile. Its middle class has been decimated. So just to put that into the picture of massive displacement, fear of civilian casualties, health infrastructure potentially being impacted.
Thank you very much for that. Now, Jasmine, there's a question here, and you know, having worked at the Pentagon, as to whether all of this and the strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities will actually push proliferation more. How do you see that? Do you think that as a result of this, actually, it's going to be more likely we're going to land up with Iran, other countries wanting to join the nuclear weapons club?
Well, I mean, put yourself in their shoes, right? I mean, what is the rules-based order offering anyone right now? If you look around the region and look at, you know, the way that international, I think Hisham mentioned this earlier, the way that international law has been applied or not applied, um, especially over the last 2 years, has left a lot of countries wondering whether it makes sense to abide by those rules. Now, some countries will have no choice but to abide by those rules because they're just simply not strong enough to buck them. But I think what you're seeing right now is this catchphrase that Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu are repeating over and over again, which is peace through strength. People in the region are, and I'm sure Hisham can jump on this, and Azadeh as well. They're not putting the emphasis so much on peace. What they're really hearing is strength, and that the more strength they have, the more likely they are to be respected and to be taken seriously. Whether that's huge economic strength, like you see with the Gulf countries, or whether that's strength militarily, whether through traditional military means or proxies. The name of the game now is, how do we not get pushed around? Because this whole idea of international law and rules-based order, it just doesn't exist. It was meant, you know, it's meant for the Europeans, it's meant for the Americans, it's meant for the Israelis, it's not meant for us. And you can't really argue with them in that sense. In terms of whether, you know, also, I think this may be another question. I just wanted to point out that we really don't know the extent of the damage that these strikes did. No battle damage assessment has been really able to take place. And we won't really, I don't know if we'll ever know, but we won't know, you know, certainly anytime soon. And until we do, the other factor that might come into play if these strikes have not set back the nuclear program by a lot, then I don't see why Iran wouldn't continue to try to quickly get back to where it was while it has the opportunity. So lots of uncertainty, I think, in the days and weeks ahead. But this idea that you have to be strong, otherwise you're going to be bullied, is for me the most dangerous takeaway, not just of these past few days, but really of the post October 7th period, which only continues what the post 9/11 period started, which is this idea that strength is the name of the game and the rules don't apply to everyone.
I'm going to finish with two final questions that have come up in the chat, and quite happy if the panelists want to make a final comment in answering this. One is, what is this almost fetishism of talking about Israel's right to self-defense? This has come up in the question the whole time, and yet other countries don't seem to get that privilege of self-defense. you may not even need to answer that one. But second one, which I think is an interesting question, we haven't really touched it. What about other countries? There was a meeting today between the Russians and the Iranians. What are Russian options in all of this? So final comments in those questions in mind. Hisham.
Thank you very much. I'll be very brief because I think we're out of time anyway. But there's a framing issue here whenever this question around self-defense comes up, and the framing, which I think is, at least multiple times over the past 2 years, whenever this comes up, I'm at pains to continually point out that Israel is the occupying power when it comes to Gaza. So the self-defense point doesn't apply in that way because it's an occupying power in an occupied territory. If Gaza was a state, then that would be different, but it's not. It's an occupied territory. If it was a state that had declared war against Israel, for example, then the quote-unquote right to self-defense becomes something to discuss. But as an occupied territory, it's very different. It's like saying that the Israelis have the right to self-defense against a terrorist group that came out of Tel Aviv. Of course, it has the rights to other things, but self-defense is not the correct category here. And that's what I mean when I say this framing that goes on here. When it comes to Gaza, it's an occupied territory. The humanitarian disaster that we've been discussing is not just utterly horrendous, it's also a direct violation of the basic duty that Israel has as the occupying power in an occupied territory. And when it comes to the last 10 days, talking about preemptive strike against Iran, preemptive in international law demands that there be an imminent threat. Doesn't matter if you think the Iranian regime is horrible. I certainly do. But it matters if there was if the preeminent casus belli has been satisfied, which means there has to be an imminent threat. And nobody really bought that. But they keep on talking about this preemptive. So I think that there's a great need within the media and our discussions and our discourses when it comes to the region that we get the framing right. And a part of the framing has to be an equal value of life. I think that has been utterly absent from the conversation of the past 20 months. Otherwise, we wouldn't see tens of thousands of Palestinians being killed. We wouldn't see invasions and occupations of all these territories. And I think that without having that framing done properly, it leads to bad policy options, and it certainly does not lead to a sustainable future for the peoples of the region. And with that, I will thank you, Chris, and thank Caabu for the very gracious invitation, especially to join such an august panel.
Thank you, Hisham. Azadeh, your final comments, and perhaps you could handle the Russia issue.
Sure. Yes, I'll just go perhaps directly to that. Although, we all covered 2003, or maybe I'm just quite old amongst us, but I think if we remember the way that the establishment media essentially helped create the sort of legal fictions that produced that war, I think we're very much in the same footing. There's the reporting, the framing is just hollow. It's for those of us who have been through this once before and seen a country sort of collapse and destroyed. It's very grave. On Russia, what to say about Russia? Iran is a lonely country. It is its own fault that it is a lonely country. Russia is an ambivalent, sometimes ally to Iran. Russia is also friendly with Israel. Russia is not in any sort of military compact with Iran. Iran has not negotiated any kind of terms through which the Russians would come to its aid. I think the fact that the Iranians are disappointed that the Russians have not been more robust in their response and their condemnation just reflects how disastrously the Iranian regime read the international arena, how disastrously it's handled itself in recent months, to the point that it expects that Russia, that is actually sort of bartering its future with the United States over Ukraine, is going to like lose any political capital coming out to help Iran at this moment, a country that is not its military ally. So, what countries does Iran have leverage with Iran? What does Iran expect? Iran is very lonely, and Russia is going to advance its own interests.
Thank you, Azadeh. And finally, to wrap things up, Jasmine, your final comments.
I think I said everything that I want to say, and my co-panelists just answered those questions brilliantly. So I am going to turn it over to you, Chris, for more time. And thank you again for having me.
Well, without further ado, because we have reached the end of the session, I would just like to thank our panelists today, Daniel Levy, Azadeh Moaveni, Hellyer, and Jasmine El-Gamal. They have all been brilliant, not least because they've had to comment on very fast-paced, moving events, even as we've, as it were, been on air. They have done it in, I think, a brilliant way. Very enlightening, incisive analysis of what's going on. We're really grateful to them. And just to say thank you all for joining. And for those who haven't, please do join Caabu. My colleague Joe has put a link in the chat.
Join Caabu. Join Caabu.
Thank you, Hishem. We would love to have you all as members. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. And finally, just to say, let's hope that our more optimistic scenarios come to pass and that we actually see some return to diplomacy and away from the horrors of war. Thank you, everybody.